The sky over southern Italy was thin and cold, a pale blue canvas streaked with contrails. Far below, Allied bombers droned toward their targets, long silver columns of B-17s glinting in the sunlight. High above them, dark specks began to move. German fighters, Messerschmitts, experienced men of the Luftwaffe, hardened by years of combat. They had seen hundreds of American escort groups before, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, Lightnings, but never this. Their opponents that day flew with crimson-painted tails. At first, the Germans laughed. Colored planes? Painted red like targets? It looked like a joke, a rookie's vanity. But the laughter didn't last long. When the first wave struck, it came with discipline and precision unlike anything they had faced. Tight formations, calculated maneuvers, no panic, no waste, and then the gunfire. A clean, synchronized storm of 50 caliber tracers slicing through the sky. Minutes later, 2 Messerschmitts spiraled down in smoke. A third exploded in midair. By the end of the day, the laughter was gone, replaced by radio silence. The Luftwaffe had just met the Tuskegee Airmen, and the Red Tails had come to change history. In 1941, before the Red Tails were legends, they were an experiment born out of pressure, prejudice, and politics. The U.S. Army Air Corps, still segregated by race, faced growing calls from civil rights leaders to open the skies to Black Americans. For years, the answer had been no, justified by claims that Negroes lacked the technical ability, courage, and discipline to fly advanced aircraft. It was not science that said this. It was racism codified as military policy. But as the clouds of war gathered, the need for manpower outweighed prejudice. Under pressure from the Roosevelt administration and the NAACP, the War Department reluctantly authorized the creation of an all-black flying unit. It would be trained at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a historically black college founded by Booker T. Washington decades earlier. And thus began what skeptics mockingly called the Tuskegee experiment. The first recruits arrived in 1941. They were college graduates, engineers and mechanics, and men with skill but no opportunity. Many had applied for pilot training before, only to be rejected because of their race. Now they found themselves on an isolated airfield in the Deep South, surrounded by red clay and suspicion. Their instructors were white. Most doubted the program would last. The War Department expected it to fail quietly, proof they believed that integration was impossible. But the men who arrived at Tuskegee had something the policymakers didn't measure: resolve. Cadets like Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the son of the first black general in the U.S. Army, knew they carried more than their own ambitions. Each flight, each takeoff was a test not only of skill but of worth. Every mistake risked confirming a lie, and so they trained harder than anyone. They studied flight manuals until midnight. They endured mechanical failures, racial slurs, and the constant presence of military observers waiting for them to stumble. But they didn't stumble. By the end of 1942, the first class of Tuskegee Airmen graduated as fully certified Army pilots. Their insignia read 99th Fighter Squadron. Their aircraft and the P-40 Warhawks were outdated and underpowered, but their determination was not. When the unit deployed to North Africa in early 1943, few expected much from them. Even within the U.S. military, prejudice ran deep. White officers doubted their combat ability. Some commanders requested that the colored squadron not be attached to their groups. One general even tried to have the entire unit disbanded before it saw combat. But the 99th refused to disappear. They flew ground attack missions over Pantelleria and Sicily, strafing enemy positions, bombing supply lines, and protecting convoys. Their performance, initially modest, improved with each sortie. They learned quickly, adapted faster, and began to earn the respect of those who had dismissed them. When their combat reports reached Washington, the War Department quietly withdrew its plans to shut the program down. By mid-1944, the experiment had become a force. The 332nd Fighter Group, made up of the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Squadrons, was deployed to Italy. They traded their aging P-40s for new P-51 Mustangs, sleek silver fighters capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. To distinguish their aircraft, the men painted the tails crimson red. A bold, defiant mark that would soon make history. From the ground, the sight was unforgettable, a line of silver Mustangs streaking across the Mediterranean, tails glowing like embers in the sunlight. To the bomber crews who depended on them, those flashes of red meant safety. To the Germans, they meant something else entirely: trouble. What had started as a segregated experiment had become one of the most disciplined and effective fighter groups in the U.S. Army Air Forces. And soon their legend would be written in the skies over Europe, not with words but with victories. By early 1944, the war in Europe had entered a new phase. The Allies had landed in Italy, fighting their way north through mountains and ruins. Air power had become the hinge of the campaign, the shield for advancing ground forces and the sword that cut German supply lines. It was here, in the dust of the Italian peninsula, that the Tuskegee Airmen took to the skies in earnest. They arrived at Ramitelli Airfield, a stretch of flat, windswept land near the Adriatic coast. The camp was simple: tents, wooden shacks, and runways carved from dirt. But for the 332nd Fighter Group, it was sacred ground. It was where they would prove everything. Their new aircraft, the P-51 Mustang, was unlike anything they had flown before. Powered by the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could climb fast, fly high, and escort bombers deep into Axis territory. The 332nd's mechanics, many of whom were also Tuskegee graduates, kept the planes immaculate. Every machine bore the crimson tail that soon became their signature and their pride. The Red Tail's orders were clear: protect the bombers at all costs. Their mission was not to chase glory or rack up kills, but to keep the heavy bombers alive long enough to drop their payloads and return home. It was a role that required patience, discipline, and self-control, qualities the Red Tails had mastered in training. Their first escort missions over Austria and southern Germany were uneventful at first, but when they finally met the Luftwaffe, it was with full force. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s struck from the sun, diving straight into the bomber formations. The Red Tails met them head-on. Unlike other groups that sometimes broke formation to chase down enemy fighters, the 332nd stayed with their bombers. They fought close, defending their charges like armor around a heartbeat. Their gunnery was precise, their teamwork seamless. When one Red Tail turned, the others followed. No hesitation, no gaps. The bomber crews noticed. At first, some had doubted the colored squadron assigned to protect them. But after watching those red-tailed fighters stay through flak smoke and enemy attacks that sent other escorts fleeing, their skepticism turned to gratitude. B-17 and B-24 crews began requesting them by name. Give us the Red Tails. Each mission added to their legend. In June 1944, during raids over Munich and Ploiești, the Red Tails went up against veteran German pilots who had fought since the Battle of Britain. Despite being outnumbered, the Tuskegee Airmen held formation, shot down multiple enemies, and brought every bomber home. For many bomber crews, it was the first time that had ever happened. Back at base, the victories were modestly recorded. Mission logs filled with dates, targets, fuel loads, and kill confirmations. But within the Allied High Command, word spread. The 332nd's record for bomber protection became unmatched. They weren't the fastest or flashiest group. They were the most reliable. And in war, reliability meant life. Still, prejudice lingered. Some officers refused to believe that black pilots could perform so well. Rumors circulated that their reports were exaggerated, that someone else must be responsible for their success. But the evidence was impossible to deny. The Red Tails bombers showed fewer losses than any other group in the 15th Air Force. Their performance was measurable. In numbers, not opinions. By late 1944, even the Germans had taken notice. Captured Luftwaffe pilots described the red-tailed planes as Die Schwarzen Teufel, the Black Devils. At first it was said with disdain. Later it was said with respect. The Red Tails had become a symbol, not just of skill but of transformation. In a war defined by race, tyranny, and ideology, they embodied something greater than combat, proof that equality was strength. In the months to come, their missions would extend deeper into enemy territory, to Berlin, Munich, and beyond. Their kill counts would rise, and the same German pilots who once laughed at the sight of red-painted tails would soon learn the meaning of fear every time they looked up. The experiment was over. The reckoning had begun. The Tuskegee Airmen fought two wars at once, one in the skies over Europe and another within the country they served. On the ground, They faced the same segregation and suspicion that had followed them from Alabama. Separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate everything. Even in uniform, they were reminded daily that they were not seen as equals. Yet it was precisely this injustice that forged their discipline. They couldn't afford mistakes. Every mission was a test, every error a weapon for their critics. They flew not only to defeat the enemy, but to prove a point to their own country. That courage, intelligence, and excellence had no color. It gave them an edge no other unit had. While many American squadrons prized individual heroism, the lone ace chasing kills, the Red Tails valued cohesion. They understood that one reckless move could cost everything. Their coordination, born from shared struggle, became their greatest weapon. They didn't need to shout orders. They flew as one. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., their commander, embodied that discipline. Calm, measured, and utterly fearless, he was both a strategist and a symbol. He had graduated from West Point, where he spent 4 years in silence. No one spoke to him because of his race. He emerged from that ordeal with an unbreakable will. As commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, Davis demanded precision. He didn't tolerate arrogance or complaint. His message was clear. Excellence is our only weapon. The Red Tails took that to heart. Before every mission, Davis reminded his men of their purpose, not just to protect bombers, but to prove their worth to the world. They flew clean, steady, and by the book. They didn't chase personal glory, and they didn't abandon formation. Their job was not to be heroes. Their job was to come home and bring everyone else with them. That philosophy soon paid off. While other escort groups lost bombers to German interception, the 392nd's formations often returned untouched. Their kill-to-loss ratio climbed higher with each mission. Even their enemies began to take notice. German intelligence, accustomed to analyzing American air tactics, marked the red-tailed Mustangs as distinct, disciplined, aggressive, and unnervingly calm. Luftwaffe pilots began warning each other on open radio frequencies, "Watch for the Red Tails." But the Red Tails were not just changing combat. They were changing perception. Word of their success reached Washington, then spread across the United States. Newspapers that once doubted the program now ran headlines praising their bravery. Black communities across the country followed every mission update with pride. For millions, the Red Tails became proof that segregation was a lie, that skill and patriotism were not bound by race. Inside the military, their success forced uncomfortable conversations. Commanders who had once refused to work with black pilots now requested their escort. Bomber crews who had never spoken to a black man outside of service began to refer to them with respect. Our Red Tails. In a war that revealed both the worst and best of humanity, that shift mattered, and yet through it all, the men themselves remained humble. They slept in tents, repaired their own planes, and wrote letters home to families who still faced discrimination back in America. They knew that victory abroad didn't guarantee freedom at home. But they also knew that every success in the sky made equality harder to deny. Their missions became statements, not of anger, but of precision. They didn't march. They didn't protest. They simply flew better than anyone else. Each successful escort was an argument that no one could refute. Each German fighter they downed was another piece of evidence that excellence was the ultimate equalizer. Still, the strain was immense. Many of them were barely in their 20s, facing death daily under conditions harsher than most white pilots endured. Their aircraft were often second-hand, their parts delayed by bureaucracy, their pay delayed by paperwork. And yet they made those planes fly like new. They painted them with pride, tuning their engines with the same care they gave to their mission briefings. They were fighting for something larger than victory. They were fighting for dignity. By mid-1944, the Red Tails' growing record could no longer be ignored. The myth of their inferiority was dead. In its place stood something undeniable. Proof that the American ideal, the promise that anyone could rise through merit, was not a myth, but a reality waiting to be seen, and soon, the world would see it in the most dramatic way possible, in the skies over Germany itself. When the Red Tails took on the Luftwaffe's elite in battles that would turn their crimson insignia into a symbol of fear. By late 1944, the Red Tails had become a name spoken with quiet respect across the Allied airfields of southern Europe, and with growing unease inside the Luftwaffe's command rooms. Their legend wasn't built on propaganda or hero worship. It was built on numbers. By the end of the summer, the 332nd Fighter Group had flown more than 15,000 sorties, destroyed over 100 German aircraft, and achieved one of the lowest bomber loss rates in the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. Their secret wasn't superior machines. Their P-51 Mustangs were the same as everyone else's. Same engines, same guns, same controls. The difference was how they were flown. Where other units often broke off to chase enemy fighters, the Red Tails stayed tight to the bombers. They flew as if their lives depended on discipline, not instinct. Each squadron was a moving fortress in the sky, layered in overlapping arcs of defense. Enemy fighters diving through their formation found themselves caught in a crossfire of disciplined precision. They didn't fight recklessly. They fought mathematically. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. had drilled this philosophy into his men since training. Stay with the bombers. Protect them. Don't get drawn away. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't make for fast headlines. But it saved lives, thousands of them. The Luftwaffe never truly adapted to it. German pilots were trained for aggression, for hunting. They sought chaos, single duels, turning fights, one-on-one clashes. Against the Red Tails formations, those instincts turned fatal. Every time a Messerschmitt broke ranks to attack a bomber, a Mustang was waiting. Every time a German ace tried to lure them into a dogfight, he found himself surrounded. One German pilot, captured in late 1944, admitted under interrogation, "They fly like machines, no panic, no gaps. When you attack one, 3 attack you." It was the ultimate compliment. As the war intensified, the Red Tails began to face the Luftwaffe's elite. The Germans threw everything at the Allied bombing campaign, including the Me-262 jet fighter, the world's first operational jet aircraft. Its speed was unlike anything the Allies had seen, but even this advantage could not offset the Red Tails' coordination. They adapted quickly, striking the jets during their most vulnerable moments, takeoff and landing. In one engagement over southern Germany, Lieutenant Roscoe Brown and Lieutenant Lane shot down 2 Me-262s within minutes, proving that teamwork could counter even revolutionary technology. Their success was not luck. It was training turned into instinct. Each Red Tail pilot knew his position, his role, his zone of fire. Their communication in combat was calm and efficient. Short bursts of words over the radio, nothing wasted. They had turned precision into rhythm. Even bomber crews, who once dreaded every mission into German airspace, began to relax when they saw Red Tails weaving overhead. They called them the Angels of Ramatelli. To them, the sight of those crimson-painted stabilizers meant survival. When other groups missed rendezvous points or failed to respond to distress calls, the Red Tails never did. Their punctuality and discipline were legendary. That reputation reached all the way to the top. General Ira Eaker, commander of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, praised them publicly for the most dependable bomber escort service in the theater. For a group once created as a social experiment, it was the highest possible validation. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was disintegrating. By late 1944, the German Air Force was running out of fuel, pilots, and hope. Its veterans were gone, replaced by teenagers with only a few hours of flight training. Against the Red Tails, those rookies didn't stand a chance. In engagement after engagement, the 332nd outflew, outshot, and outlasted them. Still, the Red Tails never took it lightly. They understood that war was never just numbers. Every enemy plane destroyed meant a man who would never go home. Their mission was duty, not revenge. They flew with quiet determination, professional, steady, unflinching. For the Germans, facing them became a psychological battle. The flash of Red Tails in the distance meant a fight they probably wouldn't survive. One Luftwaffe ace wrote in his journal after being grounded, "We once laughed when we saw their colors. Now we pray not to see them again." By December 1944, the Red Tails had more than fulfilled their mission. Their kill count stood above 100 confirmed aircraft destroyed. They had never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters while under their escort, a record unmatched by any other group. Their performance didn't just change perceptions, it changed doctrine. After the war, U.S. Air Force manuals began citing the 332nd's escort tactics as model examples of discipline and defensive flying. Their methods influenced not just training programs but the very philosophy of air combat in the jet age. They had proven that control, unity, and respect for mission were stronger than ego or aggression. In the end, the Luftwaffe's downfall wasn't just written in statistics, it was written in color. Red paint, brushed onto the tails of American Mustangs by men who were never meant to exist, became the symbol of everything Germany had underestimated. And soon, as the war neared its end, those crimson fighters would escort the bombers deeper than ever before, all the way to Berlin. There, in the heart of the Reich, the Red Tails would deliver their final message. March 24th, 1945. Dawn rose cold over the Adriatic coast. The airfield at Ramitelli was silent except for the metallic hiss of engines warming in the morning frost. Mechanics moved between rows of crimson-tailed P-51 Mustangs, their breath-forming clouds in the chill. Each aircraft bore the same mark: the unmistakable red tail that had become a signature of precision and protection. This was no ordinary mission. The Red Tails had been assigned to escort a massive bomber formation all the way to Berlin, the longest and most dangerous flight of their campaign. Over 2,500 B-17s and B-24s would strike the heart of the German capital, targeting rail yards, military depots, and the last remnants of the Reich's air defenses. It was a statement mission, one meant to demonstrate Allied dominance over skies once ruled by the Luftwaffe, and the 332nd Fighter Group had been chosen for it. At briefing, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. stood before his men, map spread across the table. "Berlin," he said quietly, "the end of the line." They all understood what it meant. The war was nearly over, but this mission could still take everything from them. Berlin was defended by flak towers, radar-guided guns, and the last squadrons of Germany's most desperate pilots, including jet units flying the Me-262. When the engines roared to life, the sound rolled across the airfield like thunder. One by one, the Mustangs lifted off, their red tails glinting in the early light. The bomber crews above Italy watched them form up, relief visible even from a distance. It was the same thought every time. If anyone can get us there and back, it's the Red Tails. For the first hour, the flight was calm. The formation climbed through high clouds, engines humming in perfect synchronization. But as they neared German airspace, black smoke began to rise in the distance. Berlin was burning again. Flak fire erupted from below, black blossoms of smoke clawing toward the bombers. Tracer rounds arced through the sky. And then from the west came the enemy. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dove from altitude, followed by the silver gleam of Me-262 jets, faster than anything the Red Tails had ever faced. They came in screaming passes, firing cannons into the bomber streams. For a moment, chaos ruled, but the Red Tails didn't scatter. They broke into tight defensive elements, each covering the other's blind spots. When a German jet made its run, a Mustang was already on its tail, forcing it to overshoot or dive away. In one moment of lightning precision, Lieutenant Roscoe Brown, flying his P-51 bunny, spotted an Me-262 accelerating toward a group of B-17s. He cut across the bomber path, dropped altitude, and fired in a clean burst. The tracers connected. The jet exploded in flame, fragments raining down over the smoke-filled countryside. Minutes later, Lieutenant Charles Brantley scored another kill, his voice calm over the radio. Splash one jet, no celebration. Just acknowledgement. They were professionals doing what they were trained to do. The fight stretched on for over an hour. At 25,000 feet, the sky became a swirling arena of vapor trails and black smoke. Everywhere, bombers lumbered forward, engines coughing, wings riddled with holes, while the Red Tails darted through them like crimson phantoms. For the Germans, it was hopeless. Even their new jets couldn't change the tide. They could attack, but they couldn't control the air. Below, Berlin's ruins burned. Smoke rose thousands of feet, turning the sky gray. Through it, the bombers dropped their payloads. Rail yards shattered. Fuel depots exploded. The heart of Nazi logistics was finally broken. When the bombers turned for home, the Red Tails were still there, flying tight, guns empty, fuel gauges near zero, but formation unbroken. They escorted the last bomber out of German airspace before turning south, engines sputtering, exhausted but alive. At Ramitelli, the ground crews waited anxiously. Hours passed before the first specks appeared on the horizon. One red tail, then another, then dozens more. The formation landed in perfect order. Of the dozens of Mustangs that took off, almost all returned. The 332nd had lost only a few men. The bombers they protected had suffered minimal damage. Colonel Davis walked the line in silence as the engines cooled. He didn't have to speak. Everyone knew what they had just done, something no one had thought possible when the program began. They had escorted American bombers to the capital of the Third Reich and brought them back intact. It was a mission that symbolized everything they stood for: discipline, unity, and quiet excellence. Word spread quickly. Headquarters in Italy sent cables of praise. Bomber crews toasted the Red Tails in their tents that night. One gunner wrote in his diary, "Those Red Tails never left us. We owe them our lives." For the Luftwaffe, it was the final humiliation. Their once proud force had been powerless to stop an all-black unit of American pilots from flying unchallenged through their skies. And the message to the world was unmistakable. The color of courage was red. The Berlin mission had ended, but the war still burned. In April 1945, as Allied armies advanced toward the Rhine and beyond, the Red Tails continued flying daily, escorting bombers, strafing convoys, hunting trains and trucks across a collapsing Reich. Each day began before sunrise. Each mission ended with the smell of fuel and sweat clinging to their flight suits. They were exhausted, but they didn't stop. The Luftwaffe by then was a shadow of its former self. Its airfields were bombed, its supply lines shattered. Most of its veterans were dead or captured, replaced by boys barely trained to fly. Yet even cornered, the Germans still fought with desperation. On several missions in late April, the Red Tails faced surprise counterattacks. Ragged swarms of FW-190s and Me-109s thrown into the sky as a final act of defiance. But the results were always the same. The Red Tails struck fast and hard, using tactics refined over hundreds of escort runs. Their teamwork was instinctive now, no hesitation, no wasted movement. If one pilot was attacked, two others appeared behind the enemy. They flew like clockwork, precise, patient, unbreakable. One of their final major encounters came on April 26, 1945, near Linz, Austria. German fighters dove through a bomber formation, hoping to disrupt the last Allied strikes of the war. But the Red Tails were waiting. In a flurry of gunfire, the Mustangs tore through the attackers, downing more than 12 aircraft in minutes. Not a single bomber was lost. When the smoke cleared, the sky was silent except for the steady drone of American engines heading home. By then, their kill total had surpassed 100 confirmed victories, including 3 Me-262 jets. Their bomber protection record remained unmatched. In over 200 escort missions, not one bomber under their guard had been lost to enemy fighters. It was a statistic so extraordinary that even senior commanders doubted it at first, until after-action reports confirmed every detail. The Red Tails had set a standard that no one else in the 15th Air Force could match. The praise began pouring in. General Benjamin W. Chidlaw called their performance a model of air discipline. General Ira Eaker, commander of Mediterranean air operations, said simply, "They are the best escorts we have." And for Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., it was vindication, not only for himself, but for every man who had endured the doubts, the insults, and the quiet burden of proving a nation wrong. Yet, for the Red Tails, victory was never loud. There were no cheers in the cockpit, no triumphant songs on the ground. Just quiet relief that the mission was done, and sorrow for the friends who didn't make it home. Many of them had lost close comrades, men like Lieutenant Lee Archer, one of the group's top aces, who saw dozens of missions where fellow pilots never returned. Every empty bunk at Ramitelli was a reminder that even the best record carried a cost. When Germany finally surrendered on May 7, 1945, the Red Tails didn't celebrate with parades or speeches. They simply stood on the runway watching the sunset behind their Mustangs. The war that had defined their lives was over. The men who had once been called an experiment were now among the most respected fighter pilots in the world. Their journey home was quieter, but no less symbolic. In Italy, bomber crews gathered to thank them in person. Some painted the words, "Thanks Red Tails," on their aircraft before being reassigned. One B-17 crew chief said, "When we saw those Red Tails, we knew we were going to make it home." For the Tuskegee Airmen, that was the only recognition they needed. But the true impact of their legacy unfolded after the war. In debriefings and strategy reviews, U.S. commanders repeatedly cited the 332nd Fighter Group as a case study in combat discipline and precision escort tactics. Their restraint, their refusal to chase individual kills, became doctrine for future generations of pilots. They had rewritten the unwritten rules of air combat, and far beyond the battlefield, their performance began to erode the foundations of segregation itself. President Harry S. Truman, briefed on their achievements after the war, would later cite their example as one of the reasons behind his 1948 order to desegregate the U.S. Armed Forces. The Red Tails had done what no protest could. They had proven equality through excellence. In Germany, captured Luftwaffe officers were asked about the new American air groups. Several mentioned the red-tailed fighters. One colonel admitted, "They did not fight like others. They never broke. They fought until we were gone." For men who had once ruled the skies of Europe, it was the final confession of defeat. At Ramitelli, the airfield grew quiet. The tents were packed, the planes prepared for shipment home. Before leaving, the men gathered one last time around Colonel Davis. He reminded them that their war had been about more than victory. It had been about proving that the color of a man's skin had no bearing on his courage, his intellect, or his ability to serve. They had carried that truth across continents through fire and flak into the heart of the enemy's empire. When they took off from Ramitelli for the last time, the red tails glowed one final time against the sunrise. They had come as outsiders. They left as legends. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the red tails packed up their tents and equipment at Ramitelli Airfield. The runways that had once thundered with the roar of Mustangs now stood quiet under the Italian sun. Their work was done. The war that had begun as a test of their worth had ended as a triumph of their excellence. But as the men prepared to return home, they faced a sobering truth. Victory abroad did not erase prejudice at home. The same nation that had depended on their courage in the skies still treated them as second-class citizens on the ground. When their troop ships arrived in New York and Virginia, there were no parades waiting, no cheering crowds, no reporters asking for interviews. Instead, they were quietly processed, segregated again by race, and sent to bases that remained divided by color lines. Yet within the military command, something fundamental had shifted. Reports of their performance had reached Washington months earlier. Their discipline, their kill record, and their flawless escort missions had been verified by dozens of commanding officers and bomber groups. The conclusion was inescapable. The experiment had not only succeeded, it had outperformed expectation. Senior officers began to question what segregation had cost them. How many capable men had been overlooked because of prejudice? The Red Tails had shattered a cornerstone of military racism, not through protest or rebellion, but through undeniable proof. They had shown that competence and courage were colorless. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. returned to the United States as one of the most respected officers in the Air Corps. He was promoted to full colonel, and later became the first African-American general in the U.S. Air Force. Many of his men continued their service, while others transitioned to civilian life, becoming engineers, educators, and community leaders, but all of them carried the same quiet pride, the knowledge that they had done the impossible. In the years immediately following the war, the story of the Red Tails spread slowly, often by word of mouth. Bomber crews who had flown with them told their families, "Those Red Tails saved us." Letters and memoirs began to circulate, painting a picture of discipline and courage that defied stereotypes. By the late 1940s, their influence had reached the Oval Office. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. It was a historic moment. And while the order was driven by many factors, the performance of the Tuskegee Airmen stood among the most powerful examples of what integration could achieve. Their success had made segregation not just immoral, but militarily indefensible. Meanwhile, overseas, even former enemies had taken notice. Captured German officers interviewed after the war often spoke with reluctant admiration of the Red Tails. One Luftwaffe colonel, when asked which American group he feared most, replied simply, "The ones with the red tails." To him, they were not Negro pilots. They were professionals, deadly, disciplined, and unrelenting. But for the men themselves, Legacy was not what they had sought. Their focus had always been on performance, not politics. When asked years later how they had endured such discrimination while serving their country, one pilot, Roscoe Brown, replied, "We didn't have time to hate. We had a job to do, and we did it better than anyone expected." Still, the recognition they had been denied in 1945 would come, slowly but surely. Through veterans' reunions, documentaries, and later films, their story reemerged into the public consciousness. By the late 20th century, the Red Tails had become synonymous with integrity, skill, and the power of perseverance. Their example had proven something that went beyond war, that greatness, once demonstrated, cannot be ignored forever. The same nation that had doubted them now taught their story in schools, honored them in museums, and etched their legacy into the history of freedom. The experiment had ended, but the lesson, that excellence breaks every barrier, had just begun to shape America's future. For years after the war, the Red Tails faded into the quiet corners of history. Their achievements were real but rarely spoken of. In the textbooks of the 1950s, their name barely appeared. The Tuskegee program was mentioned as a military experiment, not as one of the great triumphs of American aviation. The pilots who had once been the best bomber escorts in the world returned to a country still divided by laws and prejudice. Many of them built new lives away from the headlines. They became teachers, postal workers, engineers, and community leaders. Some returned to the military and served through Korea and Vietnam. Others stayed silent about their service for decades, never boasting, never bitter. They carried their memories privately, the feel of the cockpit, the roar of engines, the quiet pride of proving the world wrong. But time, as it often does, began to uncover truth. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the civil rights movement gained strength, historians and journalists started revisiting their story. What they found was extraordinary. Combat logs confirming hundreds of missions, transcripts showing their unmatched escort record, and first-hand accounts from bomber crews who credited the Red Tails for their survival. The forgotten heroes of Ramitelli began to re-emerge. Public awareness grew. Books, documentaries, and interviews introduced a new generation to the disciplined, fearless pilots who painted their planes red and rewrote history. Former enemies, too, spoke with respect. German aces who had fought against them described the Red Tails as impossible to shake, calm, methodical, and relentless in combat. Their legend had crossed even the boundaries of war. In 1998, more than 50 years after their final mission, the United States formally honored the Tuskegee Airmen with a Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian awards. At the ceremony, surviving veterans, now elderly, many in wheelchairs, stood before the nation they had served. Their red jackets gleamed under the lights as the audience rose in applause that had been delayed by half a century. It was not a moment of revenge or pride. It was closure. General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had once been forced to eat alone at West Point and lead a segregated squadron in war, lived long enough to see the Air Force fully integrated and to see black pilots commanding fighter wings, carriers, and air operations across the world. His quiet resolve had become doctrine, leadership through discipline, equality through excellence. The Red Tails' influence extended far beyond the military. Their story became a mirror for America's long struggle toward its ideals. The belief that merit should define opportunity, that talent must never be silenced by prejudice. When NASA began recruiting astronauts during the space race, they drew heavily from the Air Force, an institution forever changed by men like the Tuskegee Airmen. Decades later, when African-American astronauts orbited Earth, they carried the unspoken legacy of those crimson-tailed fighters who had once defied gravity and bigotry at the same time. Today, the name Red Tails carries a meaning that transcends history. It is not just about airplanes or battles. It is about what happens when excellence meets injustice and triumphs. Their red-painted tails, once a target of ridicule, became a mark of mastery.
To every young pilot who has ever faced doubt,
their story remains a compass. Prove it in the sky. And though time has taken most of them, their memory endures in polished aluminum, restored P-51s flying at air shows, and the voices of those who remember. Each time one of those Mustangs rises into the sky, the sunlight catches its crimson tail. And for a moment, the ghosts of Ramitelli rise with it. They remind us that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it flies straight and true through smoke and hatred until the world finally looks up. The Red Tails were once an experiment. They became a legend, and in doing so they changed not just the war, but the very definition of what it means to be American. The war ended long ago. The runways of Ramitelli are quiet now, grass reclaiming the earth where red-tailed Mustangs once thundered toward the horizon. Only the wind remains, whispering through the hills of southern Italy, carrying faint echoes of engines and courage. The Tuskegee Airmen are gone, but their story has not faded. It has grown, passed from one generation to the next, retold not as a tale of war but as a testament of will. They didn't just fight the Luftwaffe, they fought the weight of their own country's doubt, and they won both battles. Their triumph was never about medals or headlines. It was about principle, the quiet conviction that excellence, discipline, and unity can break through any wall built by ignorance or fear. They proved that heroism needs no permission, that valor can rise from those the world refuses to see. When the Red Tails painted their Mustangs crimson, they were not just marking aircraft. They were marking history, leaving a streak of color across a gray, divided world. Every mission they flew was a declaration that America could be better than it was, that freedom was strongest when shared by all. Today, every pilot who takes flight in the United States Air Force inherits a piece of that legacy. Every time an aircraft lifts off from American soil, it carries the spirit of men who believed, even when the nation doubted them, that equality could fly. In the end, the Red Tails didn't just escort bombers. They escorted a country toward its own ideals. Through fire, through prejudice, through silence, they stayed in formation. And because they did, the sky has never been the same.